Chapter 1: The Fall of the Untouchable. The morning in São Paulo began with its usual frenzy. Helicopters slicing through a gray sky, horns blaring in chaotic symphony, and crowds rushing through crosswalks, locked in daily battles against time. From the 32nd floor of his sleek corporate tower, Eduardo Vasconcellos observed it all, as he had done every Monday for over 2 decades. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the silence of his office, a space bathed in soft reflections from the skyline, framed by glass walls, polished marble floors, and dark wooden accents that spoke of power and precision. Here, at the peak of his empire, Eduardo felt invulnerable. In Brazil's elite corporate circles, his name was synonymous with strategic vision, discipline, and authority. As CEO of Translog Global, one of the largest logistics firms in Latin America, he had built his fortune after the tragic death of his wife. Her loss had driven him into work with relentless focus, a coping mechanism that eventually distanced him from his daughter, Isabel, now a bright, principled university student who preferred the halls of academia to her father's luxury dinners. That morning, Eduardo expected nothing but routine. Yet, as he organized files for a meeting with foreign investors, his assistant entered, visibly pale and trembling, holding an envelope. She explained it had been dropped off anonymously at reception. Curious, Eduardo opened it without hesitation. Inside was a plain black USB stick, no markings, no explanation. Against his usual protocol, he inserted it into a secure, offline laptop. A video began to play instantly. There was no music, no narration, just raw, chilling images. Crates bearing the Translog logo being unloaded in a dusty warehouse somewhere in the Middle East. Armed men retrieved weapons and explosives from the containers. Children cried in the background. At the end, white text appeared on a black screen. "Their blood is on your hands." Eduardo froze. His heart pounded like a war drum. He tried to rationalize: sabotage, corporate rivalry, a deep fake? But the footage was disturbingly authentic. The crate serials, the warehouse's GPS coordinates, the logos, all real. Somehow, his company's logistics routes were being used to transport arms to war zones. Panic gave way to grim determination. Eduardo launched an internal audit, reviewed shipping records, and scoured contracts. The pattern emerged slowly but undeniably. Dozens of Translog shipments had been rerouted to false destinations. Some branches had falsified customs documents. Others had processed transfers through shell companies in offshore accounts. A name began to surface repeatedly: Celso Mendonça, Translog's chief financial officer and Eduardo's longtime friend. His signature was on several irregular authorizations. He had processed deals through entities that didn't exist on paper. Eduardo felt a new kind of grief, not the suddenness of death, but the corrosion of betrayal. Days later, another message arrived. This time via a burner email address. The sender only signed off as RR and attached more videos. These were recordings of meetings inside Translog offices, blurred faces speaking in code about destinations, weapons, and financial channels. There was also a bank transaction trail, linking Translog's internal network to accounts used by known extremist groups. At this point, Eduardo could no longer deny the scale of what he was facing. His company wasn't just being exploited. It had become part of a global machine feeding off conflict. And he, the man at the top, hadn't seen it. That week, a note appeared in his car, no envelope, just a scrap of paper under his windshield. "Your silence is no longer safe." It was unsigned. From then on, the weight of paranoia became unbearable. Meetings with investors turned awkward. Clients began to distance themselves. Employees offered strange glances. Eduardo felt the walls closing in. Alone in his marble tower, he wasn't the master of the game anymore. He had become just another pawn. Sleepless and desperate, he drove to an old apartment he kept in the city center, far from his corporate world. There, he connected a personal laptop, off-network, and started cross-referencing data, manifests, offshore transfers, encrypted memos. In the midst of it all, a name kept resurfacing: Karim. It appeared in remittance orders, customs clearances, and hidden email headers. But no one by that name existed in the system. Whoever, or whatever, Karim was, it had become the cipher of a much larger operation. Eduardo realized then that he had been blind for too long. His legacy, his reputation, and his company had become tools for destruction. And someone wanted him to find out. As he sat in the dim glow of the laptop screen, watching another shipment being hijacked by shadows, Eduardo understood something chilling. The fall had already begun. He just hadn't hit the ground yet. Eduardo follows one of the suspicious shipping routes on a solo mission, hoping to uncover physical proof. But leaving Brazil only brings him closer to danger, and to the heart of the conspiracy. Chapter 2: Route into the Shadows. The decision was made in silence, sometime between midnight and dawn. Eduardo packed lightly, carrying nothing that could trace him back to his identity as the CEO of Translog Global. His mind spun with questions, half-formed theories, and the haunting image of his company's logo stamped on crates of death. But he didn't need answers, not yet. He needed proof. Irrefutable, physical evidence. The audit had revealed a pattern. A specific shipping route from South America to North Africa appeared multiple times in recent months, always masked by fake manifests. The destination, an abandoned logistics hub outside Rabat, Morocco, registered as a dormant Translog subsidiary. According to the company's internal system, it hadn't processed shipments in over 2 years. Eduardo booked the flight under a false identity, one built from years of backdoor corporate travel: Miguel Almeida, international logistics consultant. No security detail. No announcement. Just him, his instincts, and a notebook hidden in the lining of his jacket. He flew overnight and arrived in Casablanca just before sunrise. The heat struck immediately, dry and unforgiving. Eduardo avoided luxury hotels and instead checked into a modest pension on the outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood too quiet to draw attention. He kept his head down, his appearance rugged, wearing a worn jacket and simple clothes. The goal was invisibility. By late morning, he rented an old sedan and drove eastward to the coordinates extracted from the company's records. The facility stood amid decaying warehouses and overgrown lots, a relic from a past life in global trade. From a distance, it appeared deserted. The large metal gate was rusted shut, the walls sun-bleached and cracking. But Eduardo waited. After 2 hours, a dark van approached from the west. 3 men got out, their movements too coordinated to be casual. One held a remote. The gate opened. The van entered. The gate closed. Eduardo's heart pounded. He raised a pair of binoculars, watching through the shimmer of heat. Inside, faint lights flickered to life. Shadows moved quickly across the interior. This was no abandoned property. Something, or someone, operated in the dark. That night, Eduardo returned. He parked far from the site, walked through alleys and brush, and climbed to a nearby rooftop that offered a view of the facility. With a hidden lens mounted to his glasses, he captured footage. Men unloading crates under low light. Shipping pallets stacked with goods. Containers being rebranded with false labels. No words were spoken, but Eduardo didn't need audio. The images spoke volumes. He returned the next day, determined to get closer. A hole in the perimeter fence led him to an alcove hidden by scrap metal and weeds. From here, he could hear murmured conversations in multiple languages: Arabic, French, and occasional English. They mentioned shipments moving through the Sahel region, heavy arms procurement, and digital payments routed through crypto networks in countries with no extradition treaties. One name was repeated: Karim. But the way they spoke of it made Eduardo hesitate. It was no longer just a name, it was a mantle. A title passed between intermediaries. A myth wrapped in blood and finance. Suddenly, A dog barked. Loud. Persistent. Two men with rifles emerged from the shadows, moving toward his position. Eduardo froze. He pressed himself against a steel drum, heart racing. After several agonizing minutes, the barking ceased. The men turned back. He waited until the facility was silent again before retreating to his room. But when he arrived, he knew something was wrong. The door to his pension room was slightly ajar. Inside, his bag had been searched. His clothes disturbed. Yet nothing was stolen, except his notebook. On the bed lay a folded piece of paper. Want to know who Karim is? Istanbul. Room 218. Narrated Hotel. 7 days. No signature. No sender. Eduardo stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily. His pulse thudded in his ears. He sat down, reading the note over and over. His instincts screamed danger. But he also knew this was his only lead, the next piece of the puzzle. That night, sleep eluded him. The Moroccan heat pressed in, thick and suffocating. But it wasn't the temperature that disturbed him. It was the unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. That he had stepped too close to something meant to remain in the shadows. And someone, perhaps several someones, wanted him to keep going. In Istanbul, Eduardo will uncover more than just criminal secrets. He'll discover that his own family may be connected to the Translog conspiracy. A painful truth awaits, one that could destroy everything he thought he knew. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Name. Istanbul was chaos and order entwined, a city where past and present danced across cobblestone streets and neon-lit alleys. Eduardo arrived earlier than instructed, checking into a small hotel in the historic district under a different name. He booked a room 2 floors below the one mentioned in the note, room 218 at the Narrated Hotel. For the next 5 days, Eduardo watched in silence. Nothing happened. No visitors, no odd movements, no sign of whoever had left the message in Rabat. It felt like a dead end, but Eduardo had learned not to trust appearances. On the 7th day, just before sunset, someone entered room 218. Eduardo waited 15 minutes before making his move. He knocked, holding a random piece of mail as a prop. The door opened. The person on the other side was not what he expected. A woman, young, sharp-eyed, with dark hair tied back and a steady presence. She looked at him for a long moment, then opened the door wider. Her name was Naila Rahim, an independent journalist whose work focused on armed conflicts and shadow financing networks. She invited him inside. The room was quiet, dimly lit by a single lamp. On the bed, dozens of documents were laid out: photographs, shipping invoices, falsified contracts, and names, many of which Eduardo recognized. But what stopped him cold was a folder marked Eduardo Vasconcellos Internacional. The name hit him like a blow. That foundation had been created by his father in the early 1980s, supposedly as a humanitarian project. Eduardo barely remembered it. The foundation had been dissolved long before he took over Translog. But Naila's documents told a different story. For nearly 2 decades, the foundation operated as a hidden financial channel, laundering money and routing resources to authoritarian regimes and violent paramilitary groups. And worse, it had done so through the logistics network Eduardo believed he built from the ground up. Naila had been investigating this network ever since her brother was killed in a militia attack in northern Africa, an assault carried out with weapons traced back to Translog containers. Her research had led her across continents, connecting corporate names with ghost accounts and humanitarian initiatives with arms trafficking. She told Eduardo that Karim wasn't a single person, but a code name adopted by various handlers within the network. A title passed like a torch, covering decades of global operations. She had uncovered records showing secret meetings between Eduardo's father and a much younger Celso Mendonça, indicating that Celso had been part of this scheme since the beginning. Eduardo sat in silence. He wasn't just the blind figurehead of a corrupt machine. He was the inheritor of a system born in shadows, grown through exploitation, and protected by legacy. That night, he left the hotel alone. He walked along the Bosphorus, letting the wind and city lights wash over him. Istanbul pulsed with life around him, but Eduardo felt hollow. For the first time in his life, he didn't know who he was. The company he had built was not his. The legacy he defended was a lie. And the father he revered had created a monster disguised as benevolence. Later, Nayla met him in a hidden cafe nestled between ancient stone walls. She brought more than documents. She brought a plan. A former employee of the Foundation, Helene Dubois, now under protection in Switzerland, held the final key, a digital drive containing archives of the organization's transactions, communications, and political ties. But there was risk. Helene's information threatened powerful people, not just in Brazil, but across borders. Nayla insisted they had to act quickly. Eduardo agreed. Before parting, Nayla gave him a warning. They know you're awake now, and they don't forgive those who open their eyes. Eduardo didn't sleep that night. He stared at the city from his window, the call to prayer echoing in the distance, as the weight of generations settled on his shoulders. He had inherited a throne built on bones. And now, he had to burn it down. In Geneva, Eduardo and Nayla meet the Foundation's former accountant. But before they can secure the final proof, betrayal strikes from within, and someone close turns out to be playing a different game. Chapter 4. The Geneva Trap. The air in Geneva was cold and dry, the kind that clung to your skin and whispered caution. Eduardo arrived under yet another alias, this time posing as a logistics consultant from Lisbon. Nayla had taken a different route, arriving a day earlier to secure their meeting with Helene Dubois, the elusive former accountant of the Eduardo Vasconcellos Internacional. Helene had agreed to speak under strict conditions: neutral ground, a single meeting, no recordings. Her location was known only to a humanitarian agency that had protected her since she vanished from public life. According to Nayla, Helene had once handled every layer of the Foundation's financial infrastructure and had kept detailed archives. Their meeting place was a quiet house on the shores of Lake Geneva, surrounded by leafless trees and overlooking the misty water. Eduardo arrived early. He was tired, but focused. He carried the partial documents, encrypted drives, and the lingering weight of betrayal. When Helene entered the room, she moved slowly, a frail woman whose eyes had seen too much. She clutched a folder of yellowing papers and barely spoke above a whisper. But her words carried the weight of buried truths. She confirmed everything. The Foundation had always been a front. Even in its earliest years, it was never about aid or humanitarian projects. It had been a financial machine built to sustain clandestine influence, funding military regimes, fueling proxy wars, and laundering billions under the veil of goodwill. Helene described a system designed to be untouchable: offshore accounts under false identities, contracts with deliberately vague language, funds funneled through shell companies in tax havens. And always, at the center of it all, Translog, the perfect vessel. Its global reach, opaque cargo handling, and reputation made it an ideal cover. She said the final piece of evidence, the master key to the Foundation's digital vault, was stored in a safety deposit box in Lausanne, under a different name, protected by biometric encryption and physical tokens. Eduardo and Nayla left with renewed determination. They drove to Lausanne before sunrise, using backroads and changing their route twice. The bank, small and discreet, opened its vaults under a quiet marble lobby. Helene's credentials worked. Inside the deposit box, they found a pen drive, polished, sealed, and weightless, but Eduardo knew it was heavier than anything he'd ever held. They left without speaking. But the silence didn't last. Back in Geneva, their hotel room had been searched. Nothing was stolen, except Nayla's folder. All her evidence, years of notes, research, photos, and encrypted credentials, gone. There was no sign of forced entry. Only one person besides them had known the exact location and time of their trip. Eduardo sat on the bed, fists clenched, staring at the floor. And then it hit him. It had been in front of him all along. Celso Mendonça. He wasn't just a participant in the scheme. He was one of its founders, groomed by Eduardo's father, embedded in the company from the beginning. And now, he was pulling the strings from the shadows, silencing threats, manipulating public perception, and erasing traces. But Eduardo also felt something else. Doubt. He looked at Nayla. Her story had always been perfectly timed. Her documents, precise. Her access, uncanny. What if she wasn't just a journalist? What if she had been allowed to follow this trail? What if she was being used, or using him? That night, he left the hotel without a word. He walked for hours along the Rhone River, the city lights blurring into the current. The pen drive pulsed in his pocket like a heartbeat. It held names, transactions, and orders, enough to take down governments. But now, Eduardo knew the truth came with a cost. And someone, maybe everyone, wanted him to pay it. Eduardo returns to Brazil to prepare his next move. But Celso strikes first, and his daughter Isabel is taken. The war becomes personal. Now it's not just about truth. It's about survival. Chapter 5, Target on Bloodline. The return to Brazil felt like a descent into something darker. Eduardo landed before sunrise, slipping past customs with the ease of a man who had crossed too many borders with too many identities. He wore no suit, carried no luggage, and moved like a ghost. But inside, a storm was building. He had the pen drive in his pocket and a plan forming in his mind, a final play to expose everything. Instead of going home, he headed straight to a private office once used by a trusted former collaborator. A cybersecurity specialist Eduardo had once kept on retainer for delicate corporate cleanups. The man owed him favors. And now Eduardo needed his full discretion. They began extracting the pen drive's contents. The files were immense. Thousands of documents detailing transactions between Translog subsidiaries and shell companies. Shipping logs rerouted through war zones. Donation records forged in the name of humanitarian relief. And worst of all, names of politicians, generals, judges, and corporate giants. All complicit. Celso Mendonça's name appeared more than any other. He hadn't just facilitated the corruption. He had engineered it. Eduardo knew the material was enough to cause international scandal. But he also knew better than to release it blindly. The goal was a controlled leak, encrypted data bundles, distributed to journalists, legal watchdogs, and NGOs across the world. Each file, once opened, would trigger another. A chain reaction of truth. He and the tech specialist worked through the night, setting up automated releases. By dawn, the first packet had been scheduled. Eduardo allowed himself a breath. Then he made a call he'd been avoiding, to Isabel, his daughter. She didn't answer. Concern tightened in his chest. He called again. Still nothing. He drove to her apartment near the university. The doorman informed him she hadn't been seen in 2 days. Eduardo's pulse quickened. He checked her friends, her classmates, her social accounts. Nothing. Then his phone rang. An unknown number. A modulated voice spoke calmly. "You're moving too fast. And now so is she. Return the drive, or she disappears." Eduardo's vision blurred. The voice gave instructions, a location, a time. No police. No backup. Bring the original pen drive. He collapsed into a chair. For the first time since this nightmare began, Eduardo wasn't angry. He was terrified. He had risked everything for truth. But not Isabel. She was innocent. The last part of him that hadn't been corrupted or compromised. Now she was a pawn in the hands of the man he once called a friend. He knew what he had to do. He went back to the tech lab and created multiple backups of the drive. Encrypted, partitioned, and stored in hidden cloud servers and physical copies given to trusted sources, some who didn't even know what they were carrying. One version was linked to a deadman switch. If Eduardo didn't log in within 72 hours, the data would be released automatically. Then, he prepared the exchange. At dusk, he drove alone toward the coordinates given, an abandoned stretch of road near the hills outside Sao Paulo. The air was thick, the sky bruised by storm clouds. A black SUV waited on the side of the road. Eduardo parked and stepped out, carrying nothing but the drive. From the shadows, two masked men emerged with Isabel between them. Her hands were tied, eyes covered. She was alive, shaking, bruised, but alive. Eduardo held up the pendrive. They moved in unison. One man took the drive. The other released Isabel. She stumbled toward her father. Eduardo caught her in his arms, shielding her as the SUV disappeared into the night. They sat in silence on the cold pavement. Isabel didn't speak. She didn't have to. Eduardo's eyes burned not with tears, but with something deeper, resolve. The cost had become clear. This wasn't about saving a company or redeeming a legacy. This was about taking down the machine that thought it could operate with impunity. That night, as Isabel slept in a safe house under armed protection, Eduardo triggered the first public release of the data, a controlled leak to international journalists. The war was no longer in the shadows, and the world was about to see what power looked like when it was stripped of its mask. As the leaks begin to surface, Celso Mendonça retaliates with fire, literally. A deadly attack reduces Translog's headquarters to ashes. The message is clear: surrender or be destroyed. But Eduardo has no intention of backing down. Chapter 6: Fire at the Core. The morning sky over Sao Paulo was veiled in a gray haze. Eduardo stood by a narrow window in the safe house, staring out at a city that no longer felt like his. Isabel slept in the next room, her breathing soft and steady. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe she might be safe, for now. The first wave of data had been released the night before. Encrypted packages had landed in the inboxes of journalists, whistleblower platforms, and legal watchdogs across multiple countries. Names, routes, shell companies, military contracts. Translog was no longer a respected giant. It was a node in a global crime network. And Celso Mendonça stood at its dark heart. By mid-morning, headlines exploded. Global logistics giant linked to arms trafficking. Whistleblower leak exposes high-level corruption in Brazil. Multinational CEO accused of funding extremist groups. Eduardo's name also appeared, often as a fugitive, sometimes as a whistleblower, always at the center. He knew the world wasn't sure what to make of him yet. But he also knew he had taken the first step. The game had changed. Then, around 4 p.m., it all ignited. Quite literally. Translog Global's headquarters, a glass and steel tower that had once been Eduardo's symbol of triumph, went up in flames. The explosion began at the upper levels, followed by a series of cascading detonations. Windows shattered. Smoke poured into the sky. Emergency sirens wailed. Chaos unfolded live on television. Cameras captured people running, choking, crying. Firefighters battled the inferno as reporters speculated on terrorism, sabotage, corporate warfare. Eduardo watched it happen in silence. The screen reflected in his eyes. It wasn't just a building burning. It was an entire narrative being incinerated. The fire wasn't random. It was calculated. It was Celso's answer. Every document that could corroborate the digital evidence was now ash. Files, backup servers, ledgers, gone. So were many of the people Eduardo had once worked beside. The casualty count kept rising. Dozens dead, more injured, some still missing. That night, Eduardo's face returned to the news. But this time, they called him something new, the architect of collapse. Celso's media allies spun the fire as part of Eduardo's attempt to destroy evidence of financial fraud. Anonymous sources from Translog's board claimed Eduardo had manipulated data, stolen millions, and fled when discovery loomed. It was the perfect inversion. From hero to villain. From whistleblower to arsonist. Nayla re-emerged briefly, sending Eduardo a secure message: "He's framing you." But people are starting to ask the right questions. He barely read the rest. His mind was elsewhere, not on the wreckage, but on what remained. The original recordings, including one last file from the pendrive Helene had recovered, hadn't been released yet. It was risky material, a private video call between Celso and an arms broker known internationally, discussing direct payments to warlords. The footage showed Celso smirking as he spoke about Eduardo. "He's just a brand. He makes the company look clean. That's his job." It was the mask slipping, completely. And Eduardo would use it. The last part of the plan required going public, not with hidden files or secret leaks, but with a broadcast. One that would be seen live, where Celso couldn't spin the narrative before the world saw the truth. A high-profile corporate event, broadcast across major networks, would be the perfect stage. Coincidentally, Translog had been scheduled to sponsor the Transcontinental Business Forum, an event Celso would attend in person as guest of honor. Eduardo called in one last favor from a former ally in the event's tech team. A route into the control room. Access to the feed. Just a few minutes of screen time, long enough to detonate the truth. He would infiltrate the event disguised as a logistics consultant. He'd played that role before. But this time, the costume came with consequences. Eduardo packed light, hugged Isabel goodbye, and left the safe house. There would be no second chances. Eduardo crashes the Global Business Forum and interrupts Celso's live speech with a damning broadcast. The world watches the mask come off, but now, Celso will strike back with deadly force. Chapter 7: The Final Broadcast. The lights of Sao Paulo glittered like a restless ocean beneath the night sky. In the heart of the financial district, the Grand Palace Hotel stood illuminated, its towering glass exterior reflecting the pulse of a city addicted to power. Inside, the Transcontinental Business Forum buzzed with the energy of politicians, CEOs, and media giants. And hidden among them, Eduardo Vasconcellos walked unseen. Wearing a tailored blazer, trimmed beard, and contact lenses to dull the color of his eyes, Eduardo moved through the crowd like a ghost in plain sight. His credentials read Miguel Andrade, logistics consultant from Lisbon. He nodded to strangers, smiled at waiters, and slowly made his way toward the back corridors, where stagehands and technicians managed the audiovisual systems. He had a window of 6 minutes. In his inner jacket pocket, Eduardo carried a flash drive. It contained a final recording, one that would end everything. A private video call where Celso Mendonça discussed arms deals, bribery, and the use of Eduardo as a front. The audio was clear. The expressions, unmistakable. The event was being broadcast live on multiple international platforms. Celso himself was the keynote speaker, due to take the stage at 7:45 p.m. At 7:43, Eduardo entered the control room. He greeted the technician as if he belonged there, then swiftly moved to a secondary console. His ally, a former IT consultant from his early days at Translog, gave him the nod. Eduardo inserted the drive. The system accepted it. One command. One trigger. The override would redirect the video feed to every screen in the hall and to all streaming platforms. At exactly 7:45, Celso Mendonça stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. Spotlights glowed behind him. He smiled, confident, basking in admiration. Eduardo watched from the wings. Celso began his speech with polished charisma, praising economic development, strategic alliances, and Translog's role in global infrastructure. Then, the screens blinked, and the broadcast changed. The hall went silent. The video appeared, Celso, on a private call, sipping wine, laughing as he explained how weapons moved through translog containers, how donations were falsified, how officials were paid, and most damning, how Eduardo had been used as a pretty face to mask the rot beneath. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Phones rose to record. Journalists scrambled. Celso froze on stage, staring at the footage of himself. The smile vanished. Panic flickered in his eyes. Eduardo slipped away. Security mobilized immediately. Guards stormed the control room, but Eduardo was already gone, disappearing through a maintenance tunnel mapped years ago during the hotel's construction. He emerged into an alley, where a motorbike waited, helmet strapped to the seat. As he sped through the city, Eduardo's phone buzzed with updates. The video had gone viral. News anchors interrupted broadcasts. Social media exploded. Celso Mendonça's name now trended with the word criminal. But it wasn't over. Eduardo received a message on his encrypted channel. He's trying to run. Private airstrip. Midnight. We end this now. It was from Nayla. She had been quiet for days, but now she had surfaced with the last piece of the plan. Celso would flee the country tonight, just as Eduardo had feared. But Eduardo wasn't running anymore. He was hunting. On a dark runway, under the roar of a private jet, Eduardo confronts Celso one last time. The truth is out. Now it's justice or death. Chapter 8. Under the runway lights. The private airstrip was quiet. Too quiet. Nestled in the hills beyond Sao Paulo, the runway was hidden behind rusted fences and a crumbling hangar. No flight logs. No cameras. No oversight. Just a long strip of asphalt carved into the night. Eduardo arrived an hour early. He wore black. No armor, no entourage. Just a sidearm, a burner phone, and a live transmission feed connected to a secure satellite. His steps were silent. Every move was calculated. This time, there would be no stage. No audience. Only the end. From his vantage point in the shadows, he watched a private jet idle at the far end of the runway, its engines humming. At the base of the stairs stood Celso Mendonça, dressed in a pale suit, flanked by two guards. He looked impatient and nervous. Eduardo moved. Down the slope. Across the gravel. Past broken fences and crates. He stayed low, heart beating with the precision of a war drum. From the tree-line, a second figure emerged. Nayla, rifle slung over her shoulder, eyes sharp. They nodded. No words. Together they advanced. Celso never saw Eduardo coming until it was too late. A shot rang out, not aimed to kill, but to warn. One of the guards dropped his weapon and ran. The other froze, then backed away slowly. Eduardo stepped into the light. Celso turned. And for the first time in their decades of shared history, his face cracked. There was no power in him now. No smugness. Just a desperate man trying to escape the noose he had crafted for others. Eduardo leveled the pistol, but didn't fire. Instead, he spoke, not to Celso, but to the live transmission on his chest. "This is Celso Mendonça," he said calmly, "founder of one of the most sophisticated arms trafficking networks ever uncovered. He used my company, my name, my silence. But tonight, it ends." Celso lunged, a last, pitiful attempt. Nayla struck first, disarming him with a clean move and forcing him to the ground. Eduardo knelt, handcuffed his wrists, and lifted him to his feet. Moments later, spotlights flooded the runway. Drones buzzed overhead. A convoy of armored vehicles rolled in, agents from Interpol, summoned by Nayla's encrypted signal. Celso was dragged away in cuffs, screaming curses no one listened to. The jet engines powered down. The only sound was the wind and the whine of surveillance rotors circling above. It was over. In the days that followed, footage of Celso's arrest went global. The recordings, the documents, the corruption, all confirmed. Eduardo's name was cleared, not completely, but enough. Some called him a hero. Others, a man too late to stop the machine he helped build. But he didn't care. He declined interviews, declined documentaries, declined power. He took Isabel and disappeared into a quiet life, somewhere the wind sounded like peace. Nayla continued the fight, now leading an international coalition against corporate crimes in conflict zones. Her name became synonymous with courage. And Celso Mendonça? He vanished behind barbed wire and sealed courtrooms, a relic of a system that thought itself eternal. But the truth, now public, digital, indestructible, remained.